Today, I'm thrilled to kick things off with Christopher Horn, Director of Communications of States United Democracy Centre, one of our international speakers today. We're here to talk about Chris's career, what makes him great at his job, and what is next on his journey. So let's dive in. Hi, Chris. Welcome to the podcast.
So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I'm just going to give a little bio for Chris so we understand a little bit about him. So, as I mentioned, Chris has just started with the States United Democracy Centre, where he oversees digital media relations and strategic communications. Prior to that, he has worked at the Council of State Governments Justice Centre, and also where I know him from C40 Cities, which is an international network of climate leading mayors where he developed and led communication strategies for global and regional initiatives. Early in his career, he held communications leadership roles at forest conservation and urban forestry organizations. Chris received a Bachelor of Science in Journalism from the University of Kansas. Okay, great, Chris. It's brilliant to have you here. So, just to kick off, tell us a little bit about your career journey and how did you find your way into comms?
Yeah, it's been quite the journey over the last 20 plus years. Definitely aged myself there. But as a kid, I always loved telling stories and hearing stories and meeting new people. I had a lot of curiosity, really driven by this kind of commitment to learning more and kind of growing my sense of community. I went through high school not liking English as a class, as coursework. I didn't really like reading. I didn't really. I was good at writing, but didn't like writing those essays and stuff. And I actually gravitated more towards science. And when I went into college, I actually was majoring in microbiology, but I got a really bad grade in my chemistry 101 class, my first semester. And I was like, I don't know if this is for me. And so I sort of sat for a semester and then that next summer, kind of questioning like what I wanted to do and what I was good at. And I sort of did that reflection and came back to, you know, you're a good writer, you're a good storyteller. I had this kind of aura where people like to listen to me. They like to hear what I have to say. Like they're very intrigued by my perspective. That was sort of what I was gauging from my friends and my family and everyone around me. And so I explored going to journalism and I think a real natural fit. After taking my introductory courses, I landed on magazines. And coincidentally, it's like when Devil Wears Prada came out. And so I was really into fashion and the idea of I grew up in Kansas in the middle of the US, not from like a farm or anything. I lived in a proper city, but nothing like New York City. And so I had this dream of working at a big glossy fashion mag. I think my dream job was to be features editor of W Magazine, which is this big, it's even a larger print than a normal magazine, and just this beautiful storytelling, great interviews, and just like visually and the written word. So that was my dream. And I dedicated a lot of the rest of my time in college to trying to achieve that dream. I had multiple unpaid internships where I was just trying to get that experience and build out my resume. I actually was part of a pretty prestigious magazine internship program that took me to New York, where I got to work at a really great magazine. And that was a place where they were like, you guys are really the cream of the crop and you're going to do well in this industry. And, good luck. Like, here's all this amazing opportunity and access to this field. And then shortly thereafter, we had the Great Recession. The markets went down. And by the time I graduated, magazines were laying off people instead of hiring them. And what I feel like I had spent so many years building felt like it just all was like crumbling down, which is not a great feeling. And then I got a call from a public policy foundation that was also in New York. And it turns out the director of comms there had previously been the editor of Reader's Digest magazine here in the US. And she knew the program that I had participated in the summer before. So somehow had received a few names that she could, reach out to for interviews for, at the time was going to be like a I think the title was like multimedia web intern or something. This was right around the time when everything was going digital, right?
Multimedia, gosh. Love the web
Multimedia
for these.
web. Yes. Yeah, interestingly, I still like to use it. I don't know why. It's stuck, I guess. But yeah, I ended up getting that role. And that was my foray into the NGO world, the kind of this place where you're really focused on policy, where you can engage with a variety of stakeholders, where your work has connection to kind of measurable impact. And it's not saying that magazines or journalism didn't. In fact, I think it's such a critical career and industry for our society, right? To have journalists and objective reporting and everything. But what this identified to me was like, oh, my skills are transferable, right? So, like, you know, I had spent a bit of time, a few months post graduation, being like, oh my God, what am I going to do with my life? I literally wanted to be a magazine editor. Like, how can you translate that into anything? And it was a natural fit, right? Like, you're writing pieces that inform the public about something new or something they should, that you feel like there's the need for broader awareness of, or, that kind of thing. That internship ended and I moved back to Kansas for a little bit. And then I hopped over to Washington, D.C. about 10 months later and officially started my career in the nonprofit sector. I've been in this field now for over 16 years, I think, 17 years working in the nonprofit field. Ultimately, while I've had some places where we've had magazines, right? And I've got to write beautiful long form articles that reminded me of my college experience, or being able to come up with really amazing stories that we told through video or through like a blog series that was part of a larger campaign. What I've really been humbled by is like how easy it is for you to make those kind of pivots, even if you don't choose to something where you still feel useful and you feel like your skills are coming through. So
Yeah.
that's how I got here.
And what one campaign are you particularly proud of and why?
That's a hard one. But I always kind of go back with this and I see sort of that one of the biggest highlights of my career was working at C40. And every 3 years, the organization has their World Mayor's Summit. And in 2022, I was tasked with not only leading our communication strategy around the event. So that included things like media, which I worked with my colleagues on in terms of helping us shape the message, but also kind of our digital and editorial content strategy. And then I also led our kind of main stage programming for the event. So everything really tied together. And you had this whole kind of narrative ecosystem around the event, both before, during, and after. And that was a huge undertaking. Of course, could not have done it without my brilliant comms colleagues and other colleagues across the organization. But it was really a moment that I recognized, again, referencing that sort of like, oh my God, I have to change what I'm doing, sort of, which I feel like is a voice that's always in the back of my head. Not because I doubt myself, but because I have no idea why it would be there. It was a reminder that I have the perspective and expertise and skills and creativity to be at this table with all of these big stakeholders, right? Who have ideas, who want to be on the forefront of something, who are leaders, right? And that was just like such a great experience for me. And I learned so much about not just my own abilities, but the power of communications kind of in this space. It was something that I think I will continue to reference throughout my career as kind of not just a pivotal moment, but something I will always learn from.
And I guess one of the things that people won't know about 40 is that we have 100 mayors, 100 cities involved kind of where you and I were working, but it's also their voices, isn't it, and what they want from it. So the challenge, I guess, is how do you get everybody on board? Because I think that is the challenge: is the buy-in
Right.
into say yes, that narrative that you're selling them is the one. That's
Right.
the challenge for sure.
Yeah. You're certainly right. And like an event like that, where, at the time, and certainly it would be the case today, like global sort of geopolitics where, everything was, pretty up in the air in terms of at least climate, which is what the organization was focused on, and the mayors were really what they cared about. We did some amazing brainstorms as a comms team, and we ended up on United in Action as our campaign that we kicked off before the event. And it actually kind of bled through into 2023. But we were part of that, trying to figure out the words for what were the mayors doing and what were their priorities and what were our organization's priorities and our strategic goals as an organization. And having to put those puzzle pieces together really requires creative minds. It requires a lot of collaboration and a lot of iteration. Being able to give constructive feedback, being able to adapt and iterate, like those are all big qualities that I've acknowledged I think make a successful communications professional.
Mm, absolutely. And how do you balance the ambition with the reality of like limited budgets, limited resources? I'm sure every place you've worked with has different, kind of ideals and what they want to do, but everyone always wants the best out of
Right.
you.
Exactly.
How do you balance that?
It's balancing potential and ambition and where we could go with the reality of your financial situation, even the skills you have or that your team has. That's a hard thing to do. Continuing to be resourceful is such an important trait, especially when leading a team, but also being a part of one and being a kind of an individual contributor is kind of not seeing those constraints as limitations, but more so kind of the boundaries in which you can kind of continue to move forward. I think people look at those constraints as like a box, which has four sides that you can't get past. And I would just look at them more as like a lane. So you can still go forward, but the lane is maybe narrower, right? Even with zero budget and yourself on a comms team, you can still write. You can still strategically plan. You can still use the creative part of your brain to come up with some really fun ideas on content or the right news outlet or messenger to share your key messages. You're still able to do that regardless of the realities you find yourself in. And I think it's just a reminder in moments where you feel like so much is sort of stacked against you that you can really rely on your natural abilities and skills and your experience to kind of guide you through that. And that's something that I always remember. I worked at places where it's not like unlimited resources. I've also worked at places where I'm like, what's the budget on this campaign and how many people can I use? And it's like $0. You can't produce anything through an agency or a contractor or a freelancer or anything. Everything has to be done in-house. And you have this limited amount of time. And while the maybe production level is not as high as it could be, the quality will always be good because if you're reminding yourself that yeah, you're going to come up with a great idea. So for me, again, it's just like resourcefulness, always looking ahead and reminding yourself of your abilities.
Yeah, fantastic. I think, as you say, the challenge is not just budgets, but you can use your creative mind to think
For
about
sure.
it. And maybe sometimes you think more, you think harder. I found that with a lot of charities I work with is that we get the best out of people because we know that there's no other option. So, they're
Yeah.
stretching themselves, which is always good fun, I think, to
Yeah.
hold. Those sort of.
I think it would be more common than not that most comms people have dabbled in so many different areas of communications. It's almost cliche at this point to hear that a comms person is a jack of all trades, right? But when I'm on an interview panel, whether I'm the candidate or I'm hearing from someone else as an interviewer, it's always like, I'm a jack of all trades. I can do X, Y, and Z. And I think that's the brilliant part about comms is because we've had to kind of plug and play our skills, to your point about like having, and I don't want to say stretch to the point where like, oh my God, I can't do anything, but more so just like you're stretching your abilities and you're able to connect everything. And that comes in so handy when you encounter the situation where you might have less budget or no capacity, outside capacity or whatever. So yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. And how do you look after yourself and your teams in times of crisis or really high pressure? What are you doing there with your team?
I think it's been universal whenever I worked at a place that either is constantly high pressure or we do have moments of a crisis or requires some type of rapid response. And I've found that how I show up to those moments is very kind of calm. I'm really trying to get a handle on the information before making judgment calls, right? So, like, being able to truly understand the context of the situation we're in, who's doing what, who's saying what's our role in it, is there reputational risk in that role? So like really just trying to understand the landscape before engaging in kind of a thoughtful, sort of intentional discussion around how we deploy our team to address that crisis. I think that's like an important thing to remember because I think comms especially is very naturally reactive, right? And I found this to, of course, be the case working in journalism, like in media, even working in magazines. You might have 6 to 12 months of your calendar is already kind of fixed, but you might have some changes based on what's happening. If the celebrity's trending now, or this big cultural moment happened, or that kind of thing. But particularly, like, I remember being in the actual newsroom of our college newspaper, and it's like that energy of having to be responsive and having to pivot or do things on the fly, sometimes do things without all that information that I was mentioning earlier. I think comms is just naturally that way. And so I think there's a tendency for both colleagues and leadership to rely on comms to just immediately go, but also for comms people themselves to just have that natural response of like, okay, let's get to work. Like boom, boom, boom. And I just like to inject a little bit of calm and like, hey, whether it's 20 minutes from now or 40 minutes from now, I know that like people would say, oh, well, in those 20 minutes, something could blow up. Sure. But I think either way, something is going to happen. We live in the world where even if our statement goes out in 20 minutes, the narrative and conversation will likely look different in 20 more minutes or whatever. So I think that's kind of, I don't want to call it restraint, but it's like a calm, collected approach to trying to manage that kind of high pressure moment. I think that's really important to balance that sort of gut instinct of going now versus having maybe a slightly more informed approach that might take just a smidge longer.
You're right. And I think it's for you to remain calm, isn't it? And your team will feel that way as well. And if you're sort of saying, hey, we're going to take some time on this, or we want to get it right and not panic, I think it is the thing. And yeah, it's a tough job doing that.
Yeah, I mean, you're so right that when you're in a leadership role, you are modeling certain behaviors, you're modeling certain approaches. And so it's very important to remember that your team's going to absorb your energy. And so if your energy is rushed, if your energy is frenetic or scattered, if your energy is nervous, your team's going to take that energy on. And are you going to get the best quality products and outputs under those conditions? I would argue no, you
Mm.
know? And so I think it's really worthwhile for folks to remember when you're managing people or you're leading a team that an element of that leadership is how you carry yourself, and especially in those moments of crisis, for
Yeah,
sure.
absolutely. So, talking about teamwork a little bit, what is your leadership style and how has it evolved during your career and your experiences?
I've always found when I was starting to get opportunities to manage interns at the start of their career, or when I first managed my first kind of full time person, I really made sure I understood who they were, what their goals were. They were, of course, in the early stages of their career. So they had ideas, they had dreams. I scroll through LinkedIn and I see former interns who are now working really great corporate gigs doing marketing, or they're back in journalism or something. So it's been great to see that how they themselves have pivoted. But for me, it was always just making sure that their time at my organization, their time working with me was in support of those goals, those kind of professional goals. And that I really, I value the sort of being able to motivate my team is something that I really I strive for when I'm leading a team. And motivation, I think, comes from both recognition, right, of people's success, their achievements, things that can make them feel proud and that they themselves as individual contributors have made an impact. I think it's also like challenging them, right? So understanding where there might be gaps between where they are now and where they want to be, and making sure that I'm helping them bridge that gap, and that you're not pushing them too far where failure is going to happen, and that they're going to maybe, because of that, be demoralized or not learn from it, but instead be just enough that they can totally achieve it if they do the things that I think that they need to do in order to reach that goal. The skills that they're going to need, the new approaches, the ability to work those creative parts of their brain. So I feel like at times I feel like mentor coach in terms of leadership style. But I think the reality and the kind of the foundation of my style is collaboration. I'm not uncomfortable in that role, but I think I value more collaborative leadership where I can provide direction and support and have some strategic oversight over things, but that ultimately I'm fostering this environment where everyone feels like they're a part of the work, not just delivering the work, but conceptualizing the work, evaluating the performance of that work, and trying to parse through all the analytics or the metrics or the moments where we had challenges and then learn from them. I want them to feel a part of all of that. So that's how I approach, how I approach working with people in general, but particularly how I enjoy being kind of a team lead. Yeah.
Mm, fantastic. And what's the best piece of advice you've received as a comms leader?
I'll preface my answer by saying something that I'm sure everyone listening will have felt in their careers, including you. But comms can so often be relegated to the sidelines, right? Or to the finish line. Like you're not sort of, it's generally an under-resourced and underutilized skill set and function within a nonprofit. And it shouldn't be. I think the biggest advice I've ever received is you have to enable strategy. You have to advance the mission sort of proactively. And that sort of, mostly because early on in my career, I got to experience comms, and it's not that I had bad experiences, right? It's just more that I sort of learned, you know, tactical is better than strategic, because tactical means you've successfully done your job, right? Like you launched the report and it got a lot of views, or you produced an amazing event, right? Like, so that's sort of how I structured a lot of my career. And then moving into more, as I got more into my career and got into leadership roles, that was a hard transition for me to go from being overly tactical to now being relied on, even some, although it was not all the time, right? And it wasn't in maybe some of the right discussions, still being relied on to some degree for strategic vision and direction and stuff like that. So having that, what I just said about sort of enabling strategy was like such great advice for me to just really make sure that I'm advocating for communications with senior leadership, and I'm advocating for communications for our program teams, that comms is an essential part of delivering the work. And I think that's really ultimately how I've approached every project I've ever worked on, and every organization I've ever worked at. So it really resonated with me, and it's stuck for sure.
Yeah. And what you said earlier about comms being on the sidelines or the last to know about everything, but then having to either fix things or, make it work, is the challenge that all comms people have. I'm sure everybody listening will know that.
Yeah.
I think also we have to fight to get a seat at the table. And for me, that's the big thing. It's like, not only do we need to be strategic, we need to be in the right and be able to have that say and convince people. Because I think a lot of what happens is people just don't understand what we do and the impact we can have. So very recently, I've been working on kind of how do we demonstrate that impact? How do we get people to understand that we need to understand our audience before we make clever reels or content and things like that. And just because something looks great doesn't mean it's working for us.
Right.
So I totally agree with you. It's that
Yeah,
strategic lens that we need to think about, but also convince people that that's what we need to do first.
for sure.
And it's not just make everything look pretty.
Right.
You always hear, isn't it? And you want to clobber them on the head when they say that.
Actually about a year ago, I put together like a LinkedIn series that was like 7 ways to make comms core to your mission. That actually had a few things that I learned over my career, both for comms people to do that self advocacy, but also for non comms people to recognize if you're working in programs, if you're working in campaigns or advocacy, if you're working even in like operations, for you to be able to start thinking more about how comms is a core function as opposed to a service provider. And it's not to say that comms doesn't provide service. Of course we do. It's more that the idea of comms being like a cog in the whole machine, as opposed to helping drive the machine, is where the tension lies when someone thinks comms just delivers stuff versus comms is a strategic partner. And it's something that I think when nonprofit organizations begin to recognize the value of comms, they start investing in it and they start uplifting that perspective and expertise within their organization. They actually succeed, right? They raise more money. They have more visibility of their programs. Their programs are more impactful. I think that is really, it's not the only Achilles heel, I guess, of a nonprofit, maybe that finds itself struggling a bit, but there are other factors. But I do think one way to improve the situation is to make sure that comms is not seen as that traditional sort of in-house PR agency and is instead looked at as almost like a program itself, advancing the mission directly, not sort of peripherally.
Well, that's nice. As a program, yeah, I like that. That's really good. So moving on now to the future of comms, what do you think, how do you see the role of comms changing over the next sort of 5 to 10 years?
I mean, there are a few things. We talked a little bit about crisis, and I think it ties into our conversations about strategic positioning of communications. But for nonprofits working in the policy and advocacy space, you're now dealing with a proliferation of misinformation and disinformation And I think being able to both proactively try to address that through your own annual comms strategy or just your general comms work, it's also being able to understand what you need in order to combat that and mitigate the damage that is caused by that. Part of that requires, I think, an analysis of exactly how damaging is misinformation or disinformation to the cause you're working on. So I think that's a really big role that comms has to play. So when we're talking about things like self-advocacy for you and your team, that's one area where I do think if you had a sort of strategic plan in place, you'd be able to really get to the table. I also think I've evaluated this and we're looking at it in my current position and have thought about it in my last few years at other jobs, is the idea of new media and the value it has for infusing your messaging to the audiences that really actually care about the topics that you're working on. I think
So when you
we,
say new media, what are you thinking about?
yeah, I think it's looking at podcasts. I mean, you and I are here talking more in depth about topics and really being able to go into more detail about the specific context of like, how did we get here? Or who are the key players? That extended conversation that someone can sort of hear. Obviously, it's not in real time, but that someone can sort of hear without having to have the choppiness of like an article or the lack of context of like a soundbite. Like, I think, it's a really important medium. I also think looking at content creators, I think universally around the world, we're seeing growing distrust in institutions. These span from corporations to media outlets and government. It's something that as comms professionals, we have to deal with, right? And one thing I think most folks are noticing is the growing trend of people wanting to get their news from trusted voices. And these voices are often at the community level and are individuals, and oftentimes individuals that are representative of the audience. I think that's a really important part of how communications teams are looking at expanding their network of messengers and the people that they need to engage, whether it's campaign launches or new programs or initiatives or new research or analysis on the topic that you work on. Those are really critical platforms to get your message across and reach the audiences that you need to move the needle on something. So I see those two kind of being the big, I think there's certainly others, but those are the two that I keep thinking about and wanting to prioritize from a strategic level.
And you already mentioned sort of battling with misinformation and disinformation, and maybe this sort of long form conversational style builds trust a bit more because we don't know who to believe anymore, right? We've got AI. If your algorithm's a certain way, all you're seeing is that stuff. So we do need space where we can build trust again. And I think not for profits and the public sector rely on that, don't they? That public opinion
For sure.
and public support. So yeah, I guess you're right. Just thinking of a different way to say something and give us the opportunity to say more, maybe, is the way to go. So it's all there, isn't it? As you say,
Yeah.
multimedia, a media mix of things. We still want to do PR, we still want to do news and
Right.
social, but we need more other things as well.
Yeah. There's still the value, of course, of like earned and owned media and like what you're able to do there from a traditional sense. I think to your point, if we're working under this in a world where folks are getting their information from social media and therefore, or they're selective with the podcast that they listen to or the news that they read, I think for the most part, you know, nonprofit organizations are dealing with very, universal societal challenges
Mm.
that have impacts that are more far reaching than, audience segmentations or demographics, right? They impact your community at varying scales, right? So I think these kind of new media opportunities are also ways to grow your audience and just make sure that you're maybe reaching some people that you normally wouldn't, who, through whatever research you've done, might be connected and want to donate or volunteer or advocate on your behalf, champion something like attend a class or an event or something. I think it's a really great way if you have the proper investment and the proper approach to it. It's a really great way to build your audience and expose even more people to your message.
And over to my final question now for you. Just a bit of reflection, I suppose. What would be the one piece of advice you would give to your younger self?
Oh, this is a tough one. I
Would it be your younger self that was tackling chemistry or journalism?
I'm like, there's so many different chapters of younger me. I think it's an important story. It was after my internship at the Public Policy Foundation in New York City. A full-time job didn't come to fruition, so I moved back home. And I did have this internship at a company that was headquartered in Kansas City, where I'm from. And I remember having just a really rough week of like, why am I? There were a lot of things going in my head of like failure. I'm like, I'm this age, living with my mother, riding the bus to work. Because at that point, I thought I was moving to New York. I didn't have a car. And if you know anything about American public transportation, particularly in the Midwest, it was not great. So it was Christmas Eve and I was paid hourly. And they're like, you get the half day off. And I was like, I need actually those 4 more hours because I need this money. And I got on that bus. It was like 1 p.m. And I was in the back of the bus. And I just started crying. I felt so demoralized about where I was going, mostly because I didn't have any direction. And I think the advice I would give to the person sitting there thinking that they were at one of the lowest points they've been at is, perseverance comes from a mindset of looking at the world as having opportunity versus having restriction. I think all of us have it within us. We just have to figure it out. But you have a unique gift of being able to adapt and be resourceful and pivot so quickly into something that still makes you wake up in the morning and like what you're doing and make it feel like you're impacting the world and that you're progressing, that you're moving forward. And that's the message I would share with that person.
Yeah, that was really wonderful, actually, because it does show, I think, that whatever we think we're going to be when we're young and like, I want to be this and I want to be that. I wanted to be an optician when I was 7. Then I went into technology, then I went into comms. Like we never know what's going to take us anywhere. And it's just, as you say, trying to be strong and just figure that out as you go as well. And we're never going to know everything that's coming our way and deal with it and be resilient, I suppose.
Right. And it also doesn't mean don't dream, right? I think
Yeah, exactly.
that you always should. But I think it's recognizing that we also don't live in a dream world. So like continue striving for something. And if that aspiration changes, it just means you have to redirect your energy and that you can do that. It's okay.
It's not the end of the world.
I think oftentimes when you have those I was just unemployed for a year. I think a lot of people can be unemployed for a month. And because of other factors, it weighs on them so much. And I understand why it would. And I think it's just like when something is ready for you, when the place that you need to be is there, it will come. And I think it's just important to continue also just like recognizing your value and your skills. Change is always going to happen. Things may not happen as we expected or wanted them to, but I think we oftentimes land in the places where we need to be. And at least that's been my experience, particularly in my professional life.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I'm here today.
That is a brilliant place to end. Thank you so much, Chris. So that's it for this episode of the Comms Collective. A huge thank you to Chris for sharing his insights and experiences. If you've enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to follow the podcast on your favourite app so you never miss an episode. It would mean the world to me if you could rate and review the show. It helps more comms professionals like you discover these stories. And of course, join the conversation online, share this episode on social media, and tag us using the Comms Collective. Thank you for listening. I'm Vishnee Sauntoo, and I look forward to bringing you more honest, inspiring conversations next